Homelessness, racial injustice, hunger, economic disparity. Join an ISBA Conversation. Real change begins with you. Sponsored by Let's Talk Arizona.
Salam, shalom, and peace. Good evening, everyone. I'm Azra Hussain. I'm the co-founder and president of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. Welcome to an ISBA Conversation. Real change begins with you. My co-hosts are Rabbi John Linder, who's the senior rabbi at Temple Solel in Paradise Valley. But as you can see, he cannot join us this evening. He suddenly had to be somewhere else. And our other host is Reverend David Felton, who serves as the pastor of the Fountains, a United Methodist Church in Fountain Hills. In June of 2020, Rabbi Linder and Pastor Felton and I started hosting this series with the goal of giving our audience real-life tips and tools that empower them to be listeners, friends, allies, and even advocates against racism and bigotry. Esteemed guests from various races, religions, and backgrounds join us for each session and talk openly and honestly about how to bridge the cultural and racial divides. We encourage each of you to either interact with our guests by raising your hand or asking a question, or asking a question in the chat if you're not comfortable just speaking up. This series is not supposed to be a presentation, but a discussion and a conversation around the chosen topic. Our topic this evening is colorism. I would like to ask Pastor Felton to introduce our guest.
Good evening, everybody. David Felton here, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. So it's really good to be able to join you tonight. I'm really excited to introduce Jacque Starks, our special guest tonight. Jacque is a social justice transformation evangelist. And we can all say it together: social justice transformation evangelist. She is an independent consultant with Jack of all trades, or Jacque of all trades, and she's committed to operationalizing inclusive excellence and making a sustainable difference that matters. And so I know that she is right up the alley of those of you who are joining us this evening. We've had a number of different topics. Tonight's topic is colorism. And as we discovered in our pre-meeting meeting, there are some very subtle definitions of colorism that I, for one, need to be walked through, as opposed to racism and other ways that we divide each other from one another. And so Jacque is someone who can help hold our hand and walk us through that. And I, for one, am very excited to present Jacque Starks to not only make her presentation, but as she explained to us earlier, she would very much like to be interrupted by you if you have a question, because as Azra said, not a presentation, but a dialogue. So if you have a question that you would like to have answered, you can either put it into the chat, and you can also wave your hand or use the raise hand option so that you can let us know that you have a question, and that way we can break and ask that question. I think if people ask questions via Facebook or YouTube as well, Joe, I think you can get us those questions via the chat or via text message to Azra and me, but probably the easiest way is to just do it by chat right here. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Jacque Starks.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me here this evening. I am going to share my screen here so that you can see my PowerPoint as I walk through this. And thank you, Azra and David. And as you heard, yes, at any time, even if you don't have a question and you have a comment or a thought, because we do want to be in conversation, please raise your hand and bring that to the table. Sometimes if you wait until the end, you forget, and that's fine, we'll make it happen. So colorism, I would like to share my pronouns, she, her, Aya, boo, queen, and anything would work for me. Also, I want you to know that I'm going to start with a poll here in just a little bit. But as we get into this topic of colorism, I think you're all going to be a little bit intrigued by it because they mix colorism and racism so much. So we're going to take time to tease all that apart. So I'm going to start with a poll question, but I don't have a poll for you because this is not my Zoom account. So we're just going to kind of do the poll in the chat. Are you all ready? See how I put you to work right away in this conversation? So here we go. I'm going to give you 6 choices and you can put in the chat the number, okay? So colorism and racism are the same things, just different words. That would be one choice. Different, similar, but not the same. Inconsequential, one group versus another group, or something else. So in the chat, how would you respond to that? Colorism and racism are, and you can just put the numbers in if you'd like. All right, let's see. The chat is rolling here. We see some number 2s, different. Different. I see a number 3, similar but not the same. I see a something else, okay, within the chat. All right, excellent. So let's talk to somebody that put something else. Can you share with me, for somebody who put something else, what's up? What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that sometimes it is about color and sometimes it's about racism or a combination of the both.
Okay, so you think I'm sorry, go ahead.
So there's different things going on with different people at different times.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. And as we go through the presentation, I think that will come a little bit more clear for you on maybe why they're not exactly the same from time to time. But thank you so much for sharing that. We can say if we look at these 6 things here, they're not the same things with different words. That one we can just put an X across. Are they different? Yes. Can they be similar? Yes, you will see some similarities in them, but not necessarily the same. Number 4, I'm glad nobody said that. It's very much consequential when we think about both colorism and even racism. And it can be one group against another. Number 5 can happen sometimes when you're looking at both racism and colorism. But again, you might see it a little bit differently. So I'll be interested as you go along with whatever in your mind right now about colorism and racism at the end if you have different thoughts about that. How many of you are familiar with something like this? We will not tolerate discrimination based on race, color, religion, ethnicity, sex, and go on to other categories. How many are familiar with that? You can raise your hand if you'd like to use your reaction. Something y'all are familiar with? So sometimes when people assume that or they believe that colorism and racism is the same, I would say when you look at this particular statement that you will see with equal employment opportunity, is that was very specific. When they put race, color, ethnicity, they weren't confused. They weren't finding different ways of saying racism. Race is something very specific, color is something else, and ethnicity is even something else. I will see people speak about race or color, ethnicity, and what they'll do is use one word to describe everything. So this was very intentional because they are different forms of oppression and discrimination that people have experienced and continue to experience. Does that make sense? So this was intentional. It wasn't just saying the same thing in different ways. All right. Excellent. Excellent. We'll just move on right here. So then let's go ahead and dissect these words a little bit. So if they're different, what do we mean? When we look at race, we're talking about this something that was socially constructed, and race was socially constructed in the United States by the government to put people in these categories. And if you go back to look to the original, where an original group was even identified, in the Constitution, they identified this concept of being white, right? And so when you were white, there were certain benefits that happened as a result of being white, right? So this is what we start to see within the United States government. And over time, you see these categories change. If we think about race as consequential or not government terms, go back and take a look at the census. And the census are going to always ask you these conversations about what is this racialized grouping that you belong in. There's nothing biological as race. So you might say, well, I don't know. I don't like this concept of whiteness that was written in the Constitution as this first racialized group. And that then that meant equality for everyone else. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because that same document said that if you happen to be a Black person, just given another racial form, you're only 3/5 of what we consider a white person to be. So this is where we start to see the racialization and grouping happen. So there's nothing biological about race. The race is socially constructed, and then there are certain norms that have been attributed to these particular groups over time. So then when we think about racism, we think about the rules and policies and systemic things that have been attributed to these groups that create oppression related to this group that you've been a part of. All right, so that's how racism exists. So racism is not necessarily about individuals, but it's about the systems. So this is what we talk about when we talk about race. Now let's move on and define ethnicity and why that's different. Ethnicity is more specific in your cultural heritage, right? It's your language, it's your customs, it's your music, it's the stories that you share, it's the celebrations that you have. That's more about ethnicity than race. Now, if I think about my ethnicity, there might be parts of this racialized social group that I've been socialized into that I bring into my ethnicity, but there may not be. It doesn't have to be the same. I have a good friend who is from Russia. When I first met her, she said, oh my gosh, you got to meet my husband. I didn't meet her husband for a couple of years. She said, but when you talk, you remind me of my husband. So her husband, who is Mongolian Russian, we met. We have so much in common when you think about ethnicity in terms of how he was raised and the celebrations. Even being in Mongolia, that was part of his family, they were more akin to my family than his wife's family from Russia. We're like siblings from other parents and spaces in terms of how we were raised and what we celebrated and how that happened for us. So we connect a lot, and we do a lot of celebrations together as a result of that, yet we grew up in two different countries, right? So very different space when we think about ethnicity. Again, if you have any questions or thoughts, please let me know. So now let's get to color, because this is the nature of our conversation right here. This is about the pigmentation, mostly of your skin, your eyes, your hair. It's determined by the melanin, right? So that's very different than a racialized, socialized group that was created. Now, we will often look at racialized group and attach color to them. And there was a time in the United, my dad, his birth certificate, under where it had your racial group, it says red. Think about that. Why do you think my dad's birth certificate says red? And my mom said Negro. Right? So even taking the indigenous of who my dad was and his indigenous family, then they colorized him at that. He was colorized by some color, right at that point. Now, this had nothing to do with skin. That too was a part of racialization. But we see how arbitrary the racialization is and how it changes over time, right? And how we start to confuse the colorism and the racism. So here we have pigmentation. So this is color. And this is where we see that people do experience oppression based on their skin, based on the color, based on eye color. You don't see eye color as much, but I will tell you one that happened with here. I'm going to tell you a situation that you all might be familiar with that happened with discrimination related to color in the hair. There was a company, a pretty big company that's all over. They have areas all over. They had a policy that employees could not color their hair. An employee colored her hair purple. And so they wrote her up and they said they were going to terminate her for coloring her hair purple. She said, but people color their hair all the time. But where she saw the discrimination is that I color my hair purple, but people color their hair blonde or they color their hair black, and they're not penalized. So that really is a form of color discrimination based on your hair. So we don't often think about that. That really is a form of that this young lady experienced. So we might not think of dyeing my hair blonde. If my hair is black and I dye it blonde, people would probably look at me, but they may think nothing of that. What's the difference in me dyeing my hair blonde? That's not my natural color. Than somebody's dyeing their hair purple or orange. So you see where that might happen when we look at color and how it might connect right there. So an ism is a system of oppression based on an identity. So when we look at colorism, we're talking about discrimination based mostly on skin color. And it typically is going to be disadvantages to people with darker skin while you privilege others with lighter skin or white skin. That is going to be the typical. Now, I would never say that people with lighter skin or white skin cannot experience colorism. That would not be the case. And that's not any reverse discrimination. That would be a form of discrimination. So that can happen. You don't see it as much, but that absolutely can happen. And one other definition, if we take a look at colorism from the National Coalition of Christians and Jews, again, they look at colorism as a practice of discrimination by which those with lighter skin are treated more favorably than those with darker skin. And that it's a product of the racist system that was established within the United States. But it's not only in the United States. I speak and work across different groups. I work in different countries. I think about being in Canada and even in Mexico, and how we in the United States have so much influence that we tell people in Canada, you have racial issues, when really they have colorism issues. And we do the same thing. Mexico have racial issues too. What you're going to find in most countries and cultures where they don't have you check these racial boxes or color boxes, they have colorism issues, even if they don't have these racialized boxes, not necessarily racial issues. That's another way to distinguish the difference between the two. All right. Making sense so far? Everything makes sense? Again, question, comments, thoughts, bring them out there. Bring them out there.
I had a question.
Absolutely.
I was wondering, I mean, when you speak about race, you're talking about, we speak about black, and black people are not black. They're really different shades of brown. Yeah, Asians are not really yellow. You know, I mean, the indigenous people are not really red. So the colors we use don't really make sense. If you
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the other thing that I wanted to say was that this concept of colorism is not only in this country.
Yes.
Because we have a Japanese daughter-in-law. And in Japan, the whiter you are, the better jobs you get, the higher pay you get. So it's not only just in this country.
Yeah, but interesting sideline on that. My son went to a barbershop with his father-in-law, and the barber refused to cut his hair because he didn't cut Caucasians' hair or white people's hair. You say Caucasian, it's not really correct because Caucasian is not really a color, it's an area.
So that's the thing we're talking about. And that could have been more of a racial thing. It could have been this group that's been racialized as white, not based on your color. If you happen to be a white person with these particular features, I don't cut your hair. That's probably more of the racialized. And so that's more of that. And this is where I said they can cross, but they're not the same. And what you said about colorism, absolutely. And that's my point about colorism. Colorism is everywhere. And that's why I says we talk about it as being a product of racism, but it's so far beyond. And that's what makes colorism even more interesting, because I can't name a space where colorism does not exist, but I can tell you where racism doesn't exist. And again, when I think about the issues that they have around color in Canada, now they might call it racism, but when they describe it for me, I see colorism, not racism. Different systems of socialization that starts to happen. But what you made the comment about Japan, absolutely. That's racism. I mean, colorism is everywhere, everywhere. I see a hand.
Yes, that's me.
Yes.
I wanted to know, the only white person is albinos, and they're from any group, Black, somebody wrote Hopi. I mean, any group, you'll find them. And they're, I think, the only white people really around.
So again, when we're talking white, are we talking white as in the racialized group or skin tone? But you're right, you have that whiteness or yellowness or of all the colors of albinism, absolutely. And this is exactly why we have to understand what we're talking about. But when we're talking about white as a construction racial group, that's one thing. versus white looking at skin color and lightness. So again, what you're saying are they're good conversations, good things that you're talking about to help us understand the difference between the two. Sometimes when we look at the racialized group of being white and black, this is why people might say African American or European American. So it kind of pull the color away from that to separate what we're talking about. We're not just talking about the color of you, now we're talking about the social group that you've been racialized into. And when I do conversations on race and racism, I get into those groupings a little bit more from the racialized perspective.
I believe Fred has a question.
Yes, Fred. Hi, Fred.
You need to unmute.
You're on mute, Fred. And if you're like,
and sometimes you can press the space bar to unmute temporarily, but it didn't work. So, okay, so I got it now. So Jackie, so when you say that Canada has colorism rather than racism, so can you give a specific example of that? Because I don't understand that.
sure. So in Canada, I would say, you know, you have darker skinned Canadians who are black. No, they're definitely not African Americans, right? And they definitely don't call them African Canadians. They're still Canadians, but they have a very different experience. Even like I have a good friend who's a professor. He's in the UK, and the same thing. He is a very dark skinned British person, and he has very different experiences as faculty and tenure than lighter skinned faculty, and that's about skin color. And those are some of the things that I see in Canada. People will take those situations and they see that's racism, but it's not, because he's not considered racially anything other than being British, but based on the color of the skin, they have these particular experiences where colorism exists. And those are the things that I tend to see with the situations that I've dealt with in Canada. Not because there's not a racial group for them. They're all Canadians. They're not separated as something else, but they have these very different experiences. So that's how I see that happening over there.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that now. Thank you very much.
There is a comment here in the chat section. It says colorism. When my sister-in-law's mother asked me 35 years ago, what product do I use to get my skin so white? Because her daughter, my sister-in-law, is so dark. Is that correct? Jackie, would that be colorism? And can you hear me?
Looks like Jackie is frozen.
Jackie's frozen? Okay. All right. She may sign back in. In the meantime, David, I'm going to throw this to you. So yeah, I have some trouble sometimes trying to differentiate between colorism and racism, and sometimes I think I've got it, and then I go, oh, I missed that one. So I think asking Jackie these questions is very important.
Any other comments from folks?
Yeah, I think that one of the things is that people have attitudes toward different races and different colors and different ethnic groups because they don't really know the people. I mean, one of the problems is, you know, we met Ozra through an interfaith group, and it was, you know, I mean, I had not met Christians before because I'm a Jew and I'm a minority to start with. But I mean, my contact with Muslims, particularly where I am in upstate New York, it was very minimal, you know, and getting into a group like that, you get to know people as people and accept them as people without having the prejudices from the outside pushing at you. And that's, I think, the only way to really overcome most of these things is you can actually interact with people and find out what they're really about, not by labels.
Well, if you'll just stand by for a second, we're working on getting our presenter back online. So thanks for your patience.
They didn't hear me at all.
No, see, we're not muted. Mute.
What?
Mute us.
Hey, Stan.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're not muted.
not muted. Okay. I
But that's
thought-
okay. You've got great comments. I, for one, can't believe that Naomi Lerman doesn't have something to say.
I do, actually.
Well, there you go.
Um, I'm just wondering if putting an emphasis on these kind of distinctions is that important, because, it's all bad. It's all prejudice. And while it's interesting to talk about the differences, I don't know, I wonder if it takes away from the badness of it. I'm not making myself very clear, but I'm having some of the same reaction that I had to reading Caste. And for me, it was just basically another way of explaining racism and prejudice. And it's bad either way.
I 100% agree with you, but I think where colorism is important to distinguish is when it's because it's not as blatant and apparent as racism can be. It is also intra-family, and within family segments, there's colorism. So they're not racist against each other, but they distinguish and they tend to treat others. Let me give you an example. Many times in the Indian, Pakistani subcontinent, that area, I've heard conversations where people have described people's color as, they'll say, this sister is quite fair and lovely, and the other sister has lesser color. Now, with the idea that the lesser means it's not as good, and yet the woman has more pigment, right? So if she had less color, she'd be whiter. And yet the way she refers to the other and this is a grandmother saying this about her own granddaughters. So, I think people don't sit down and go, oh, that grandmother's racist. And some people might. But what I think it is it's more what Jackie's saying is that's probably colorism. Am I right, David? Am I going way off? Or Michelle, somebody help me out here.
No, I hear what you're saying, Azra, but I think it comes originally from racism and the whole idea that white is superior. I mean,
Right.
it's based on the same belief system.
But when we say white is superior, that's colorism. Race has to do with what we did with the laws to discriminate and activate the prejudice. So there's a difference. The colorism actually came first, where we valued a lighter complexion over a darker complexion. If you look at it in the reverse, the darker the complexion, the more natural sunscreen, the more likely the folks were to survive if they lived in a hot climate. We'd do a whole lot better here in Phoenix if we had more melanin in our skin because we'd have a natural sunscreen. But that's not what's been socially constructed to be valued. It's the lighter complexion is what's been socially constructed to be valued, not the person or the group with more natural sunscreen.
And I think, Naomi, what comes to my mind is that racism is something that we can talk about between blacks and whites and reds and yellows, all of those, kind of bludgeon color words that we talk about. But colorism is one of those things that I don't think people within racial groups realize that it is functioning in a negative way, even to their own children or grandchildren. And I think that to be able to set colorism apart from racism or certainly ethnicity, it gives you a chance to talk with people who might not otherwise be aware that they have quietly been conditioned culturally to think that fairer skin is somehow superior. So it gets, I think that it's important to clarify so that we can be aware of that. It's just another way of, as you said, doing doing bad to the culture and to our families and all of that. And I see Jacque is back and she's muted.
That was just the strangest thing there. I've not had that happen before. So,
Well, we're glad you're back.
yes, I am.
Uzra and I are especially glad you're back because we were having to answer a question from Naomi. That was hard.
Did you pinch it for me? You got it?
So Naomi, do you want to answer? You want to ask your question again now that Jackie's back and get an official pro answer?
Sure, if I can remember my question. Just remember, I'm not young anymore. Basically, what I'm concerned with is that if you differentiate between racism and colorism, that you're minimizing some of the difficulties, and that the fact that I think colorism stems originally from racism and the whole idea that whites are superior. And I think that is important to keep in mind. And they're both, and also the idea that, I mean, they're both bad and they shouldn't happen. But I would be very reluctant to call a person of color out for a colorist statement that they might make. I would just be very uncomfortable with that. Whereas I would not be uncomfortable commenting about a racist statement.
Thank you for sharing. You know, and what happened is we don't talk about colorism as well, just like racism. We don't really talk about that. But just as racism has been very uncomfortable for people to speak to, Naomi, so is colorism, because we don't talk about it and we don't differentiate it. It's easier if we just put it all in one pot and make it all the same and pretend we're dealing with everything. But they are two very different things. And remember that racism is a construction that's a United States construction. Colorism has been around a very long time. And we were having a conversation with David, you know, when we met, we even talked about, even as we think about the concept of Jesus and who Jesus is, right? If you look at, or even with God, when you read in the Bible, there's a very different description in the way you Europeanize and whiten the skin. So both from the racial and color perspective, you see this total shift. And so that whole concept of colorism has been around for a very long time, and probably even it does predate racism, because racism is something that's very specific to what's happened in the United States. And what we have done is we've confused colorism and racism so much that we think it's all the same thing. And that's just something that's been done to us over time. But to know that they are different, they are different. And the thing with colorism, again, colorism, just like racism, but it impacts the way we perceive other people. It really interact with interactions as well. And the reason I say that is you might not even notice, but if, again, as I was sharing before I got kicked out, is that if you might find yourself in a grocery store or on a sidewalk with somebody, and if they happen to be darker, you might find yourself moving away from that person and not even really knowing that, and not even recognizing that it's the color of the skin that makes you feel a certain way about that person. The way you are believed or not believed based on the color of your skin is something that happened as well. There's treatment, there's favorable treatment. And we see this if you go look in workspaces and who gets hired into spaces and who gets to promote. If you are lighter skin, it's going to be easier to get those higher level positions than even if you're darker skin. And I'm not talking about being black versus white. I'm talking being if you are a white person with darker skin, there's an impact. If you are indigenous with darker skin, Latinx with darker skin, Indian with darker skin, you will see these same things over and over again, those patterns. So it impacts treatment. And also we see within prison systems, and not just within the United States when it comes to colorism, but if you have sentences, maybe the maximum is 10 years, but the lighter person gets 5 years. Or in the case of the young man from Stanford, which was both a racial and color, he got really no time, the young man who raped the one woman. So these are things that we see within these systems. And also this colorism sets up beauty standards. And this is something, again, that goes beyond race. It can include race, but it goes beyond that. So we see these different beauty standards about what's beautiful and what's not beautiful. I have a clip, and I know with time getting shut down is going to impact us. I won't show all the clips, but I do want to show this particular clip to you. And I want you to pay attention because this gives an example of colorism and looking at beauty standards. So think about what you see, what you hear, and we'll have a brief conversation about that afterwards. And I hope, Joe, I put my sound on when I came back in.
छुप छुप कर काहे को लड़कियों की क्रीम लगाए उनकी त्वचा है कोमल कोमल और तुम्हारी रफ एंड टफ त्वचा नहीं उनके जैसी क्यों ना समझ तुम्हारे
इमामी फेयर एंड हैंडसम आम फेयरनेस क्रीम मर्दों की सख्त त्वचा में नहीं समा पाते। सिर्फ फेयर एंड हैंडसम में है अमेरिकन डबल स्ट्रेंथ पेप्टाइड और जड़ी बूटियां जो अंदर समाए और गोरा बनाए 4 हफ्तों में।
Hi, handsome. Imami Fair and Handsome, दुनिया की number 1 fairness cream for men.
Yeah, what did you see? What did you hear on that? Right? And so the standard of beauty, even think about when we see kids and you say, oh, he's so cute, she's so cute. It's usually going to be more targeted toward the one with the lighter skin than darker skin, even given to kids that are standing right there. So when you think about colorism, what did you hear? What did you see? Anybody want to share?
You know, Jackie, I'll share a little bit. What I find interesting is I can remember in college, I mean, girls would go up on the roof of the house that we lived in and get as tan as they could. So it was almost the opposite. The feeling at that time, this is pre-knowing that you do that and you're getting skin cancer. But they really wanted to be as dark as they could.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the tan is that it was done for a specific reason, a specific time, and it was going to go away. Now, if it was going to be, you were going to get tanned and you were going to be that way for life, it's a very different thing. It's almost like putting on a costume for Halloween for a moment. So that would be the difference within that. I'm going to get tanned for this particular thing or to do this, and I can be done with it if I want to. If they were going to get tanned, they were going to be that way for life. You would see a very different thing. Not too many people say, well, let me go get tan, let me get darker. Intentionally, let me be that way forever. But mostly what you see is what you see in this clip right here. The hair, the handsome man, the fair lady, you see the clock. Let's turn you back to have whiter skin, right? Let's become whiter and not darker. So yes, tanning is more, I would say, like doing your hair in a different style than it is about colorism, because if it doesn't work for you anymore, you get to just not do it, right? But for other people, your melanin, your skin color is what it is. You don't get to just take it away without putting some of these particular products in there. Any other thoughts about the clip?
Yeah, it was so blatant. You know, it equated fair with handsome. I mean, it was disgusting.
It is. It is
But
disgusting.
Well,
I
it
do
also
have a question related to that, Jackie. That because you mentioned that colorism has been around, you know, for forever. Have there ever been any societies that favor a darker skin rather than a lighter skin?
You know, and there probably societies probably exist somewhere. I can't tell you of any
Mm.
right offhand, or in looking, that's not usually the case, but there could have been. For it, I don't know right offhand. Somebody else on the call might know of a society where darker skin is more favorable. Not to my knowledge, but there definitely could be. Thank you. I think somebody else had a thought too that they were going to share.
Yeah, Jackie, I was just going to say I didn't translate the commercial, but I did hear the word American in English in the commercial. And it just is saying, hey, it's associating being American with being white. So there's even more going on in that commercial, because it's not just saying, hey, let's whiten your skin, but so that you can be American, assuming that real Americans are white.
Yes.
Sorry about the rest of you. So
Yeah, and that's a whole nother conversation about what does it mean to be American, right? And I will speak to people sometime and they'll say, well, I ran into this American person. I said, well, who is this person? Can you describe the person? Because they will, I'm sorry, but they will say American instead of white. And that's what they meant, right? So again, and yeah, good point, David, absolutely. So anyway, other reasons we want to think about, whoops, I'm gonna move on right there. The other thing we want to think about and why we need to talk about colorism is this whole skin lighting. Here, when I put this together back when, it says it is becoming an $8 billion, it is over an $8 billion business. This whole skin lightening. And so it shows that it's not stopping. And there's research that even show in times of recession, when people don't have money, they're going to make sure they have in their budget. If skin lightening is something that they do, that is not something that they're going to take out of their budget, even if they cannot afford a loaf of bread. Right? So it's huge in terms of that. This is another reason we need to talk about that. And there can also be consequences to your skin and medically. And I don't know with Michael Jackson what happened with his skin. A lot of us speculate that he wanted to lighten his skin and he did so much with his skin that it eventually caused harm and other medical conditions. I don't know, but those are just things that we speculate about with that. And again, with colorism, it crosses all racialized groups. It crosses all societies, all families, right? And most of them will deem in one way or another that the lightness of your skin is going to be so far superior over darker skins. So that's something, even if we look in the United States, though, go back historically, if we go back to the enslavement of people, the lighter skinned people who were enslaved got to be in the house, and the darker skinned people who were enslaved got to be, they had to go outside. And then the darker skinned Black women who were enslaved, they were considered to be more sexual than the lighter skinned people who were enslaved. So there's implications around that, like I said, crossing all different barriers. We had at Rio Salado Community College, it's been a few years back, we had an all-day Saturday event. People actually stayed for the whole day where we talked about colorism and we talked about hair and the whole thing. And there were stories that people told, very personal stories about that. And one young lady who is Korean American, she just considered herself United States American, but she talked about being Korean American. She talked about being adopted into a family into the United States and going back and finding her family and understanding her adoption and being told that you were too dark. You were darker than the other kids. So that's why she was adopted out to a family in the United States, because she didn't fit within and we heard different stories like that within families, or people who got favored, where my cousins who were more light skinned get longer hugs, or they get better gifts, and all sorts of things that people experience. People who experience in colorism within their families, it is something that really stand out for them in their communities. All right. Again, question, comments, or thoughts? And you know what? I know the chat is going and I'm moving through. Is there anything in the chat?
Yeah, there's a couple of comments in the chat. One is from Mariam, and she said, this is what I experienced in South Asia as a white American. I was asked, what product do I use to get so white from relatives? And then Gail said, my youngest granddaughter is light-skinned compared to her Navajo siblings. The older ones tease her and call her white girl or white patty.
So that's why we have to talk about colorism, because it goes so deep and it crosses so many things. Especially I see it so often within families. So very different than racism. So to have those conversations and to really think about how do we call it out, root it out, and move toward change right here.
Another comment from Kim. A friend of mine who volunteers for a refugee organization, she finds that more people were eager to help light-skinned Syrian refugees versus Rohingya darker-skinned refugees. So,
yeah. Thank you for sharing. So I hopefully we're starting to see the impact of this and why we have to look at that. And quite often it's out there, but we don't talk about it and we don't call it, or maybe we don't have the language. And that's why people will just call it racism. And they say racism is happening versus colorism is happening here. So I do want to show this clip as well. This one is called a bleaching syndrome, but I think it will kind of reinforce how colorism just crosses with all different groups and societies. And it even for some groups and some individuals, also who you marry and who you think you love, you know. I love this person, maybe you do, but that person's skin color could have so much more to do with it than maybe the fact of who this person is. And you will see that both on the side for men and women, I don't want to have darkness in my gene pool. Don't marry a Black person, don't marry a dark Latinx person because you don't want that in your gene pool. These are things that people talk about as well. So let me go ahead and play this clip for you and think about your thoughts about this.
Because of colonization and mass migrations from Europe, most Americans have been of European descent. As a result of slavery and colonization, light skin evolved as the American ideal. People of color assimilate around this ideal every day. One way is the bleaching syndrome, a social phenomenon influenced by the internalization of alien norms, whereby people of color alter various aspects of their identity to mimic white identity. For Asians, Latinos, Native Americans, and African Americans, this syndrome comes with metaphors to signify the stereotype. Succinctly put, a person of color on the outside, but white on the inside. For Asian Americans, despite high rates of education and income, societal rank is impeded by non-white racial features, including darker skin and conspicuous eye folds. For many Asian women in particular, interracial marriage, urogamy, is seen as a solution, a form of the bleaching syndrome. Their offspring are lighter skinned, rounder eyed, and thus closer to the white ideal. Latinx Americans face discrimination on a basis of their skin color and language. Many Latinos identify themselves as members of the American white population. Hence, the government has recently adopted the category of non-Hispanic white on the U.S. Census. Following conquest by white settlers from Europe, by way of feedback loops, Native Americans have internalized white traditions and ideals. This preference among Native Americans for light skin is the manifestation of discrimination relevant to American history. Persons of African descent are cognizant of their skin color. Those of light skin are sometimes Oreo, black on the outside and white on the inside. Considering this, the bleaching syndrome has spawned a new biracial movement. The bleaching syndrome is not limited to people of color or skin color. It pertains to all stigmatized outgroups who do not fit the Eurocentric ideal. Much of the Academy has overlooked this phenomenon via its obsession with race.
And what I like about this clip is it shows the marriage between colorism and racism, right? So we see what colorism is, we see racism, and we see how that marriage between the two, it kind of convolutes and confuses and even makes it a little bit more, not just damaging, but difficult to really tease out and work through. Any other thoughts about this clip? And it shows why the two, to me, if you look at this one, it brings out for me why the two are often confused. Any thoughts about this before we move on?
Because I was going to make a couple of comments before I saw this. When you were saying that everywhere in the world, every society looks at color and gives precedence to people with lighter tone. And I was just wanting to say that for the history that I know from about 1000 AD, there was colonization going on from the Vikings, from later tribes in Europe. And in one sense, my point was going to be, I think I'm beginning to understand colorism in terms of being in every group of folk, regardless of what their ethnicity is, regardless that somehow lighter skin is better. But I kept thinking, but that's partly because in much of the world, that colonial history of 1,000 years has, really given that idea that that's the superior thing. And whether a person in their heart really believe that, knowing and being grounded in the rich ethnic backgrounds that we each have, it was almost a survival thing to try to have your family blended in better. And so I guess I'm feeling very pained by realizing that would be actually loving grandmothers who would somehow be making comments to grandchildren or treating them differently to try to have them be whiter. That's a very sinister thing for sure. But that's the part that I really hadn't understood.
Yeah.
I understand. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't know if you were finished. You were cutting in and out, so I didn't know when you were, if you were finished or still going.
It's time to finish.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. And I don't know that I would call it sinister. I don't believe that any grandmother just intentionally said, let me do this. Sometimes you just don't notice, just like you don't notice when you walk away. But people who are experiencing it all the time, they notice. And then when you call somebody out on it, they go, oh, no, but I'm a really nice, good person. I would never do that. So sometimes I don't even think they notice, but people who are seeing that happen to their kids, or those kids who are experiencing it, they notice it. And then you start to keep kind of tracks and tick marks. And you say, something is happening here. And they may not even recognize it. And again, do we have the verbiage to talk about it and call it out? And is it even a comfortable thing to do? Because you might get that defensiveness. But oh, no, I love my grandkids the same. And you probably do love your grandkids the same. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's sinister, because we just don't really talk about it to be able to identify it so that we can do something about it, right?
Yeah, and frankly, Jackie, I didn't mean in using the term sinister, I wasn't imputing onto a grandmother what her thoughts and her feelings were. I was trying to say that whole societal historical system that had the domination of the European that, embedded particularly in our continent, but all over the world, that how they looked was the ideal, and people to survive began to adopt it. So no, I agree with you. I think those grandmothers probably don't even see some of that action in terms of how their grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Again, other reasons we need to talk about it, this concept, and you see this a lot. You hear about when you see a lot of research out of Asia where this idea of being fair, and they believe that comes from when you had, wealthier people who weren't outside or didn't have to be out, that they were lighter skinned, and maybe the people who worked in the field who they titled peasants had darker skin. So in Asia, they believe that that is also part of that you become more desirable, and maybe even a symbol of wealth, right? That you see.
It's almost a caste system thing.
Right, different systems over there. And also colorism society, when I talk about families, it can lead to, and it does lead to this self-hate, right? And this internalized oppression for different. I'm not going to show this particular clip, but some of you might, just because of time, you might be familiar with the doll experiment that they did in the 50s when they desegregated the schools. Well, CNN, and you can look this up, they repeated that with different groups of kids to say, let's see how they, and they call it a racial study. This is where you see the confusion. They say, we're going to do this study on race. But this was all about skin color, where they would put these different colors, spectrum of colors, and say, which one do you like the best? Which one is the nice one? Which one is the bad one? And then these kids from different groups, they were kids who were racialized as African-American, racialized as European-American. They did this in Mexico. They did this in many different groups to just kind of get a feel for how these kids saw this. They call it race, but really it was about color. And of course, the majority was like, if you were the lighter skinned or on the whiter side over here, you were good. If you were over here, you were bad. And the only reason the kids could think of as well as just the color of the skin. And I thought one thing that was really sad for me with one of them is the one young lady, little young girl who was Black, and then when they asked her which one looked like you after she picked the darker one, then she had to put the darker doll out there. And then when they were in Mexico doing this particular study, for many of these young Mexican kids, they would, again, the white one was the better, the darker one was bad. And for these kids, even when they had darker skin and they said, which one looked like you, they would pick the whitest skin one. That's what colorism does to you. So I don't even get to be who I am because there must be something wrong with it. And the one young Black girl said, well, this is ugly. She's pointing to her skin. because this is ugly. So maybe I need to be like that. So in this place where these kids could speak about this, and this is what you see, and they take that into their life, so it can foster forms of self-hate about who you are. Who's a part. I'm not gonna show that one though. Here's a rhyme that I remember growing up, and I don't know if any of you have ever heard this, is that if you're black, stay back. If you're brown, stick around. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're white, you're all right. Remember this rhyme. And I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but I think it might have come from the Daughters of Confederacy. I'm not sure, where they would teach catechisms to their kids about what you do, what you say, how you behave. So this is one that we would see quite a bit. But another one that I would hear is that you would hear within the African American community, when they would see maybe a lighter skinned black one who was very light skinned, or male, they might say that person is light, bright, and almost white, So these are some of the things that you would hear growing up that also ties into this concept of colorism that can lead to types of self-hate. I think somebody was going to get on there. Sure. I thought somebody started to say something.
I was going to say, when I was a kid growing up, they referred to light-skinned black people as high yellow women. And I remember there was a fella, it's a derogatory term, but I'm going back to the period, this was in the 40s. He referred to a light-skinned male as chink, because it was more of an Asian color. So that was the term that was used. And that's what the fellow was referred to. I never knew his name. That was the name that he was called in the neighborhood.
And many of you, if you really start to think, and you might think, I don't know colorism, if you start exploring it, you're going to probably find so many different examples of colorism and how it has impacted your world. Think about with the royal family. Remember, I don't know if you all saw the Oprah Winfrey interview, and they talked about, well, what's going to happen with this baby? What color is he going to be? Harry said somebody, he didn't say who, and his family asked, but somebody wanted to know what the color of this baby was going to be and how that was going to impact the family. So it's through everything. It's just so pervasive, this concept of colorism. I'm not going to show this clip, but it's another one where if you have an opportunity and you want to pull this news clip, and I'll be happy to share this with Osra to share with you all. But in this news clip where they're talking about these twins, these young ladies are twins, they refer to them as they're rare, and you have this black one and this white one, and
twins in the UK are making news after the Daily Mail wrote about how they are a very rare set of twins.
I'm not going to share the rare set of twins because you heard that. So if you get a chance to look at it, you will see some of the language of colorism within that particular clip about these ladies who are twins, and people don't even believe that they're twins because they're looking at not their features, not how they really look alike, but somehow because they have different skin colors, are they really twins? And they get questioned with that quite a bit. Good question. Here's some language of colorism I'm going to go through quickly. I can pass for, it's typically white. It could be something else. Yeah, you can respond. You can clap, shout if you've heard some of these. Here's some more. That we have a paper bag test, and this was in the African American community. I've never passed a paper bag test where they put the paper bag to your skin to see where you fit, where you belong within a particular group.
Never heard it.
Out of the sun, you're going to get dark. You're my cute tan child, or your tan is so cute. And if you have a child that's not tan, what do you say to that child? What do you say to that one? You married up. You're going to get that out of your gene pool. You'll get that darkness out of your gene pool. Mm-hmm. And think about some of the other things that maybe you have heard and experienced. So, and I'm going to pause right here because we're down to 1 minute. I was trying to rush because I got kicked out. But here on this page, there's just some things that if you want to dig deeper into colorism, here's some things that you should explore. Here's some deeper, take a picture of this. And I know this is recorded, so go back and look at the recording. And you say you want to have a colorism within your group. Here's some points that you would want to pull together to have those deeper conversations. Talk about why we don't talk about it. Why don't we separate it, and really explore this a little bit more. And it's going to help you dig deeper in the conversation about colorism. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. Azra, sorry for going over time, being kicked off, but I wanted to get there. So we can do question, comments, or thoughts, or you can close it out wherever you want to go. I'm going to follow your lead.
No, is there anything that you'd like to finish up with, or is there any one last thing that you would like to say? You've been answering our questions, and I think Nancy has. Nancy, are you applauding? I'm sorry, I thought I saw raised
Yes,
hand.
yes,
Thank-
I'm applauding. I'm saying thumbs up. I don't find the heart here to put on there, but you're doing some important things, Jackie. Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
so welcome.
I'm sure.
If I had anything, Azra, is don't be afraid to explore colorism. And when you hear colorism happening versus racism, start calling it out to make people comfortable, right? And because knowing, especially when it's in your own home, in your own family, in your own community, explore deeply how it is happening in your family, in your community, and that's a great place to start.
Jackie, we have a comment here from Gail. She says, I looked up If You're Black. It was a song 60 years ago by Big Bill Broonzy about America's Jim Crow.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. David, do you want to say something before I close out?
Oh, Gail stole my thunder. I was just going to say Big Bill Broonzy was a great Chicago blues man. And that'd be kind of a cool opening song for you to use and, for your presentations, because it's specifically to criticize the racial tensions in the country, but it was obviously it's been used out of context to kind of like impose things on people. But he was an influence on the Beatles and everybody, so he was quite something. So, and anybody that's an influence on the Beatles is good in my book. So
thank you for sharing.
Hey, we really appreciate you being with us, Jackie. This is a topic that we've only scratched the surface of. There are so many other directions that we can go, and we so appreciate you kind of opening the door for us to start thinking about this. Is there a resource that you can direct us to that we can dig deeper, either be it by book or blog or vlog? If there is, we can definitely put it into the Islamic Speakers Bureau page so that people can follow up on that. But maybe you have something to share just right off the top of your head.
Azra's waving.
Well, no, because Jackie was kind enough to share at least 6 items with me this afternoon, and we're getting them up on our website as we speak, hopefully. I will, when we send you out our thank you email this evening for joining us, I'll make sure to have that link in there for you. Jackie has included, I think, a couple of video clips, some articles, and quite a bit, actually. She was kind enough to share that with us. So please look to your emails. If you don't get the email in your inbox, check your spam folder. Every so often it goes and sits there, but we will send that out tonight. So you can go check out the thing. Thank you, David. I'm going to thank all of you and Jackie. And also, by the way, the person who takes care of all our tech stuff, you never get to see him, Joe Balian, is ISBA's chairman. Thank you, Joe.
Yay, Joe.
And thank you, David. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I will share a link, like I said, in our thank you email tonight for the resource page. To help you learn more about this topic. Like David said, this is only just scratch the surface. So hopefully this will be good, a good way to start. ISBA is a nonprofit organization, and we would like to continue to provide educational, interactive programs just like the one tonight at no cost to our attendees. We ask that you donate to ISBA so that we can continue to provide these and other ISBA programs. I will share a link here in the chat to ask you to donate to us. And with that, we will try and host these kind of conversations once every 6 to 8 weeks as time and topics allow, so that we can keep these kinds of conversations and these kind of thoughts alive and remind us of what is needed for real change. We hope you join us again.
And Uzra, if I could just encourage people, as long as you're here, don't leave YouTube without going down and pressing the subscribe button and pressing the little bell, so that the next time one of our Real Change Begins With You programs comes up. If you've missed it somewhere else on social media, you'll get reminded by YouTube that it's coming up or that it's on. And it also helps get the Islamic Speakers Bureau raised up in the algorithm, the more subscribers that the group has. So make sure to subscribe down there and to press the bell so that you can keep being reminded of upcoming events.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Didn't even think of that. So you're not on YouTube right now. This program was recorded. It will be put onto YouTube in the next few days. And when you send your friends there to watch it, when you go and watch this program again on YouTube, that's when you can like it and subscribe to.
Thumbs up.
Thank you. Thank you all. Be safe, be healthy. Good night.